So this video is about how to protect the inheritance that you leave for your children from their past, present, or future divorces. I'm Paul Rabelais. I'm an estate planning attorney. We have this conversation a lot. A parent or parents come into the office and they say something like, you know what, Paul, we've worked hard. One of our children, I'll call him Pierre, we want to make sure that what goes to our children or what goes to Pierre and doesn't go to Pierre's wife and Pierre's stepchildren or something like that. They usually throw in comments like, you know, Pierre's wife, she sure can spend that money. Or, you know, Pierre's wife doesn't let us see our grandchildren as much as we'd like. Or it seems like every holiday, Pierre and his wife, they got to go to her family and we never get to see Pierre and our grandchildren on the holidays. Sometimes people say, you know, Pierre's wife, she has kids of her own and, you know, that's fine, but we want to keep things in the bloodlines. Sometimes they say, you know, Pierre's wife, she just controls every move he makes. She's a very controlling person, and we're concerned that if we leave an inheritance to Pierre, you know, she's going to immediately control everything. So I want to go through what some of the things that people do are. First, I'm going to go through, you know, what typically happens, and then I'm going to go through, you know, when you put those protections in place, you know, what are you protecting things from and how it all plays out. So if you have no real protections for that potential divorce or spousal influence situation, what always happens is you pass away, things go to Pierre. Now, most people are aware that when Pierre receives his inheritance, it's his separate property. And some people say, well, hey, that covers it. It's Pierre's, it's his separate property. It's not community property, end of story. And maybe it is. But sometimes it's not the end of the story. Sometimes, let's look in the real world. Pierre inherits $500,000. His wife has control over him. They immediately go spend it all. Pierre's left with nothing for later years in life just because of her influence. And let's say now that maybe she doesn't have that much influence over Pierre, but what happens is our Louisiana law that we have community property, separate property. Our community property law says that the fruits of separate property are community property. So Pierre gets $500,000 and maybe some of it is in a savings account or a CD. Maybe some of it's invested in stocks. Maybe he has a piece of rental property. Well, all of the income that gets produced from his separate property, the interest, the dividends, the rent, all of the fruits, all of the income become community property of Pierre and his wife. So the income isn't protected. And then what happens is when the income gets, or the community property gets mixed with the separate property, then we have this presumption in Louisiana that everything in the possession of a spouse is community property, and the spouse who wants to rebut that presumption has to prove it. Or maybe just Pierre gets $500,000 and he commingles that money with money that Pierre has with his wife that they either have at the time of the inheritance or they get afterwards. And again, if community property and separate property get commingled so that you can't tell what's what, because of our presumption of community property, it all becomes community property. And if Pierre gets divorced, he has to split half of the inheritance. So some people want to take a couple of extra steps simply to protect Pierre's inheritance for Pierre. So let's talk about what that looks like. What most people want to protect is they want to make sure that it stays the separate property of Pierre. They want to make sure that the fruits of the separate property remain separate. They want to make sure that Pierre's spouse can't influence Pierre into doing things that Pierre shouldn't be doing with his inheritance. And some parents even want to say, well, I want to leave it to Pierre, but when Pierre dies, whatever is left goes on down to our grandchildren, Pierre's children, not Pierre's wife and her children, our step-grandchildren. We want to keep it in the bloodline. So let's talk about sometimes how we affect that. Oftentimes, when we're setting up the parents' estate planning program, we set it up so that when they pass away, what goes to Pierre, that proposed $500,000, it doesn't go to Pierre, it goes to what I'll call the Pierre Trust or the Pierre Inheritance Trust. Adding a layer of protection so that what's in the trust is separate property. It really can't get commingled with other community property that Pierre has with his wife. So it forces that inheritance to be kept separate. Now, in addition, in Louisiana, whether the parents want to encourage Pierre to do this, that's a separate discussion. But a spouse can sign a declaration, and the effect of that is the fruits of the separate property remain the separate property of the spouse. So Pierre can sign a declaration. I'm reserving that the fruits of my separate property are separate property, so all that interest, dividends, rent doesn't become community property. But to make that effective, he's got to give a copy of that to his wife, and he's got to record it in the conveyance records of the parish where Pierre owns real estate and the parish where Pierre lives to be effective. So that's the way that Pierre can make sure that all of the income that gets produced from his separate property is his separate property. Some of the conversations that we have when we set this up: who should be the trustee of Pierre's trust? Should it be Pierre, giving him that control to remove things from the trust and commingle it? Or are you worried about that spousal influence so that someone other than Pierre, or maybe someone with Pierre, should be the trustee or co-trustees of Pierre Inheritance Trust? Those are conversations that you can have. And then another conversation that you might want to have is, now when Pierre dies, you left $500,000 to the Pierre Trust, and let's say when Pierre dies, maybe it grew. It was invested and it grew to $800,000. Or maybe Pierre did spend some of it, and when he died, there was only $200,000 left in the Pierre Trust. Do you want to dictate where the remaining assets in the Pierre Trust go when Pierre dies? Then that's one of the benefits of using trusts. A little more control over what happens under some different circumstances. Know that you can't do what I made another video about, is what's called a prohibited substitution. You can't leave it to Pierre and say Pierre must preserve it and then pass it along to his children, but you can use trusts to really accomplish the same thing. So be aware of that. A lot of parents, because divorce is so prevalent these days, a lot of parents like the concept of protecting what they have for their children, so that if their children get divorced or have been divorced or might get divorced in the future, all that inheritance stays protected, not only for the child, but then potentially for the child's children. And so if you'd like to, you maybe even have a conversation about making sure those protections in place, you may want to call the office. We help people all over the state of Louisiana. And I would say, if you have a chance to talk to me, say something like, yeah, Paul, what we want to do is we want to have those protections in place that you talked about Pierre's parents putting in place for Pierre. And then I'll say, oh, I got it. You watched that 7-8 minute video, and you want to make sure that you give those protections to your children. So, a lot of times the inheritance is needed for the long-term retirement years for the child, and if a mistake gets made, or if you don't set it up the right way, poof, it's gone, and you kind of maybe have messed up your child's future. So I'm Paul Rabelais. Hope that helps. Make sure you take care of this stuff. Leave a legacy for your family. Last great gift you'll ever give them. Hope this helps. Comment on the comments. If you have some positive comments, subscribe to the YouTube channel. You'll get more instructional videos. And if you want to, contact the office. Let's start and have a conversation. Have a great day.